Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Calvinism channel. And so today we're going to talk about a big theological question that is it's raging all across the internet. What about open theism? And so what is this theology? How does it relate to the Calvinist Arminian debate? And so we're going to examine this question in some detail. So what is open theism? Open theism is the idea that God can be acted upon by his creatures. He's open to interacting with his creatures. It also means that God himself can change his mind in his course of action, that God can repent from certain plans, like in the flood that God repented that he had made man. It also follows therefrom that God does not know the future either entirely, or that the future is entirely open. Now, even though open theism is a relatively new phenomenon, it really isn't so new. It has its roots all the way back in the Augustine-Pelagius debate in the early church, and afterwards during the Reformation in the Calvinism-Arminianism debate. So open theists and Arminians, provisionists like Leighton Flowers, they think that they're presenting a new theology or a new way of thinking, but there's nothing new under the sun, according to Proverbs, and so therefore, they're just really taking old ideas, old false theological views, and repackaging them in a new package. Only the package, the external, is new, the way of presentation. So open theism, it's a very sharp reaction against hyper-Calvinism, not against true Calvinism, and we'll get into details about this. And so since humans can act upon God, this means that they have true autonomous libertarian free will, that they can act independently of God, that their free will is not determined by God's will. Even though in our classical verse for the Calvinism channel, Jesus says that you did not choose me, but I chose you to go and bear much fruit. And so why is open theism a problem? And so for this we have to understand this chart here. And so in the middle we have a balance like a scale. And on one side we have God's transcendence, and on the other we have God's immanence. In the middle we have Calvinism, which balances both views, and on both extremes we have hyper-Calvinism, which really overemphasizes God's transcendent character, and Arminianism, or free will theology, which overemphasizes God's immanence and therefore also causes imbalance. And so that's why it's important to see that Arminians are really reacting against a straw man, the hyper-Calvinist straw man, which is the predominance of God's transcendence over against God's immanence. But so what is God's transcendence? God predetermines all things come about because of God's will and plan. God is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, and controls all events in between. God is above all things, that is, he transcends them, and is sort of far away, he's distant, he is above all things and controls all things. Transcendentalist imbalance occurs in hyper-Calvinism, which is a distortion of true Calvinism. In the Calvinism channel, we do not espouse hyper-Calvinism, we are true Calvinists. Arminians such as the Leighton Flowers and many others, and also open theists, they caricaturize Calvinism as hyper-Calvinism. This is very widespread, but it's a straw man. What about God's immanence? God is close by, and he interacts with his creatures. He walks among his people, so to speak. God is among his people by his Holy Spirit, and most importantly by becoming flesh in his Son, Jesus Christ. God became man. God came close up. He was born in a manger. He became one of us, and so he is immanent. God shows his human-like attributes. He can be joyful, sad, grief, anger. He shows anger. He chases the moneylenders out of the temple. He is sad when Lazarus dies, and he can also be very joyful. The free will theological tradition concludes that man has autonomous, libertarian free will. Open theism upholds God's immanence, so much so to the complete detriment of God's transcendence and sovereignty. So in other words, in Arminianism we have a scales, and there is imbalance, although Arminians do uphold God's sovereignty and his planning, that God has foreknowledge. But this can go so far to the extreme as in Open Theism, when the left-hand side touches bottom, touches the floor, and it becomes 100% immanence to the elimination, virtually, of God's divine attributes such as omnipotence or omniscience. That God does not know the future. That's heresy. And so the error of Open Theism, as we have seen, is that it claims that even God cannot know the future, all the future. So it, basically, in my mind, it means that we have to throw out the book of Revelation, throw out the 12 prophets. We would have a very downsized Bible if Open Theism is true. And God loses his divine attribute of omniscience. But however, if God does not know the future, how can he even prepare for adverse emergent events? Like a volcano or disease or sin or what have you. God only reacts to events and can be caught off guard even. So thus God is also not omnipotent. The God of Open Theism lacks essential divine characteristics of the true God, and thus is a form of atheism. And yes, that's true. What about Open Theism's relation to salvation? In order to be consistent, if our free will ultimately determines our salvation, then we can also unchoose God. We can choose and unchoose God any number of times for as long as we want. We can go back and forth. And indeed, every single sin of ours, when we sin, we distance ourselves from God. It's like we're turning away from God. And so there's a back and forth every day, all the time. Therefore, choosing God becomes an act of man, and salvation becomes works-based. You actually have to be in a state of grace of choosing God to be saved. Otherwise, if you sin before you die, then you will be damned, and you will lose your salvation. Now, let's take a look at a video by Leighton Flowers and his colleague Mike Wagner on What About Open Theism with Mike Wagner. And so this is a video by Soteriology 101. And so let's take a look at Leighton Flowers' view on Open Theism and how consistent he is, really. So what is Leighton Flowers' position on Open Theism? Leighton Flowers opposes both Open Theists and Calvinists, albeit wrongly, of being on opposite ends of the determinism spectrum. Calvinists are accused of absolute determinism, thus man has no free will, no libertarian autonomous free will, which Open Theists and also Leighton Flowers upholds. Coming from the other end of the spectrum, Open Theists uphold free will, therefore God does not determine all things, and is thus open to human interaction. And also, since God does not know who will choose him, God does not know the future. Let's take a look at Flowers' strawman as how he accuses Calvinists. Notice how Flowers describes Calvinists as being pure determinists, as though that is all there is in the Calvinist system. However, at 347, in his interview with Mike Wagner, Flowers admits that he knows that some Calvinists admit free will to the picture. This is the balanced picture of true Calvinism that Flowers to a large part ignores. He does acknowledge it, but he just glosses over it. This is the theological concept of concurrence. So this is a picture of true Calvinism as we saw earlier in our presentation, where immanence and transcendence is nicely balanced. In Exodus 14 we have Pharaoh battling within himself, hardening his heart against the Israelites, not wanting to let them go, but at the same time it is God who is hardening Pharaoh's heart to do this action. In 2 Samuel 24, God's Spirit moves upon David to number the people, so that David, in his pride, he numbers his people to exalt himself, that he is a king of such a large, mighty nation. Yet in the end, it is David who acknowledges his own sin. And we can also mention Judas, who, by his own free will choice, he chose to betray Jesus, but it was God's plan that he would do so. Or Philippians 2, chapter 2, verse 12 to 13, that we must work out our salvation. And this is God's immanence, but it is God who is working in us both to work and also to will, which emphasizes God's transcendence. And there are many more such verses underscoring concurrence in the Bible. So this is true Calvinism. This is a true picture of Calvinism. What about God's character? Flowers states that open theists damage God's character by limiting his ability. That Flowers is harsher towards Calvinists, in quotations, in that he claims they attack God's goodness and love by denying the possibility of salvation to some. But let us not forget that free will theology, such as Leighton Flowers' provisionism, assigns babies dying in the womb to damnation because they cannot make a free will, autonomous, libertarian free will choice for Christ. So Leighton Flowers also limits salvation to some, and so what God is this? What love is this? Leighton Flowers has the same seeming problem. Flowers performs a sleight of hand. He claims that Calvinists and open theists are two extremes on the determinism spectrum. Calvinists on one hand determine every single last action that God makes. Open theists on the other extreme claim that anything can happen in the future, and even God does not know it. Arminians, provisionists like Flowers, they claim that the middle ground, that man has libertarian free will, but God still has foreknowledge of every event. So here in option A, we have Calvinists on one end, absolute determinism, and on the other end we have open theists with an open future, two extremes of a certain spectrum. And so Flowers stakes out the middle view of provisionism, that God is sovereign but then also has free will. But what about in option B, that there's true Calvinism, transcendence, and immanence, as opposed to provisionism or free will theology, which overemphasizes immanence to a large degree, or to an extreme, overwhelming degree, as in open theism. So I think that the bottom view is true based on what we have discussed so far in this presentation. Now, is Flowers an open theist? And so God does determine all things because God controls all things. However, in a mysterious way, man has free will to choose God. If provisionists like Flowers were consistent, then they would be open theists. And so, to illustrate this, let's read part of page 36 from The Potter's Promise, which is Leighton Flowers' book on provisionism. Suppose you went for a walk in your local park and happened upon an elderly man playing a game of chess all by himself. You stop and ask him why he is playing both sides of the chessboard. He says, "It's the only way I know to guarantee my victory." You continue on your way to find another elderly man playing chess with an actual opponent, followed by a line of challengers as far as I can see. One by one they are defeated soundly, without much effort, due to the wisdom and abilities of the elderly chess master. Which one are you going to go home and talk about? Which one is really greater and more praiseworthy? Well, good question. But the question is Leighton Flowers really an open theist? Now, in this example, notice in the second example, the second chess master, the wise chess master does not know all things in advance, but only reacts to them. If this second chess master did really know all things, he could calculate any number of chess moves in the future and thwart his opponent, meaning that this chess master would have all knowledge. He would be able to do anything. However, this does not differ from the first chess master, that is, the deterministic God, so to speak. He is only drawing in another person into the game. This leaves the only other possibility that the second chess master does not know all things because of his finite knowledge, not knowing the future. This is the God of Leighton Flowers, which is the same as that of open theism. And so in conclusion, open theism is a heresy because of its complete imbalance towards God's immanence. It leads to atheism. However, consistent free will theology, like provisionism, also leads to open theism. There is no middle ground. Leighton Flowers is consistently an open theist, as we saw in the chess example. True Calvinism is a biblical viewpoint because it balances God's immanence with his transcendence. And thank you very much for listening. God bless you.